Hey gang, I'm here again today with Steve Richards. He's a psychotherapist, a hypnotherapist with many years of clinical work, and one of the founders of the Institute for Psychosystems Analysis, which is a worldwide training institute for therapists. He's got a lot of cool insights, and today we're talking about the dangers as well as the healing powers of the imagination. So stick around.
Hello, Professor. How are you?
Hey, how you doing?
Not so bad, thank you. Nice to see you.
It's great to be here talking about this cool stuff with you. I saw that video on ego strength and differentiating fantasy from imagination, and I wanted to expand on that discussion, if that's all right.
Of course, yeah, no problem.
So the first thing I want to do, I love sharing notes with you to see where we agree, and we come at things from different angles, and so that's always great to get that binocular kind of vision. So how do you? I didn't quite hear in that video how the more precise way that you define ego strength, and I was curious as to how you came at that concept.
Yeah, for me, that's defined by homeostasis. So if somebody is functioning properly enough, then that's in whatever context. So that's dynamic straight away. Then that's ego strength for me. If that's not there, then compromise will emerge from our perspective with respect to homeostasis, internally or externally or both. And then additional pressure will start to generate all sorts of Ghanaian phenomenon or psychedelic transferences, that kind of thing. So at another level, or in another way, it could be described as a kind of robustness to be able to withstand things, either psychosocially or internally with respect to what may be pushing forward for expression.
Okay. I guess I should back up a second. I dove right in. But I wanted to give kind of the overview of the notes I'd prepared for this talk, and I wanted to talk about ego strength, but also further examine that kind of dangerous power of fantasy. All right, as you guys talked so clearly about that, the potential pitfalls, and so that's why I was starting with ego strength, because I think they're related.
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So the way I describe it when I'm teaching about it is I start with basically just the concept of it's the ability to tolerate intense affect.
Yeah.
Right. And or resilience. There's a lot of research on resilience, and I think that ties in really nicely to ego strength. So part of it is inherited, right? Part of it, there's a genetic component, just like everything else, right? Yeah. So people just naturally kind of ego tough, But then there's all kinds of things that can make it change it for better or for worse. So I usually talk about, I use the metaphor of a ship on water. So sometimes you have a ship that's on nice calm water, so you don't need to have a great big metal ship, right? You can have a raft. Versus sometimes when you have a ship that it's on choppy water. So when I'm talking to someone or working with a patient or thinking about how I'm doing, I ask myself, like, how choppy is the water and how strong is my boat? And that gives me an idea of ego strength. So they interplay, right? So like in this case, the metaphor would be the water would be like the unconscious or maybe just life experiences. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. Obviously, I'm approaching this from a specific angle, and I think I mentioned in the video that where there is ego strength, then no problem, but where it's not there, either because it's obvious or it's not obvious, then that's a problem. And the not obvious is the worst problem of all, of course, because that's downstream of any additional loading.
Okay. So how do you go about helping a person strengthen or improve their ego strength? Like, do you do basic exercises, or how do you guys approach that?
Well, I do what I normally do, believe it or not, and that's actually ask their unconscious mind to give me an indication of the state. The
Right,
unconscious,
'cause it knows.
it sounds odd. When you get used to it, it's not. But basically, asking the unconscious for permission to help a person move incrementally.
Mm.
And if there's any doubt from within, it will come out and it will say. And you can then follow the game of 20 questions, for example, sort of analog here, and say, okay, it's not all right now. Will it be all right at a certain point in the future? Or does something have to happen first before you can allow me to help this person? And I build as much of that in as possible. And of course, the person is witnessing their own response from within and witnessing what I'm saying within a context which is safe and intended to help them. And they can see that there's a lot of care being taken and a lot of confirmation that is being requested, and respectfully so.
Right.
And then once that's built up, you're actually building up ego strength in someone immediately, because the transference then, such as it is not diffuse. It's happening real time, and the person is experiencing how the unconscious is responding to that. That means they're conscious of the transference rather than unconscious of it, when a person is simply allowed to project it, so to speak, onto a rather blank and bland interface that is the other person of the therapist.
Okay. So yeah, you just go straight to it.
Yeah, and it works.
Yeah.
It does work. It's an incredible thing. I learned this a long time ago, that actually and guess who taught me? A spiritual healer.
Oh yeah.
Always to say thank you. And I thought, this works for him. I'm going to do it. And when
Now you have to set the stage for that with people first, don't you? Do you like get them into a proper mental state and all of that kind of stuff? So that's how you prepare for that.
Yeah, I mean, the way that we conduct a therapy session or an assessment, typically, if there is such a thing, but the main thing that happens is making people, or allowing people, to feel comfortable enough to receive a communication that bypasses their normal consciousness and talks directly to their unconscious mind. And I say there are incremental ways of doing that. The traditional one is to use Chevreul's pendulum to establish an ideomotor connection, because most people have not experienced that before in their life. An impediment might be, for example, that they correlate that with something occult, or like using crystals or whatever to over a pregnant woman's belly to see what the sex of the child is. So we would dispense of that first, that kind of misunderstanding about what it is. And I do that by demonstrating it on myself. And I do it, I think you probably were, first of all, by correlating simple yes and no signals, and then by attempting to deliberately lie and see what my unconscious will say about that. And what it shows is that my unconscious will not agree with me lying to this person. So immediately you strengthen that and say, well, I said I am wearing a top hat. It's completely true. I sit here before you and I am wearing a top hat. And meanwhile, the watch is going crazy, saying no. in the direction that we have calibrated in that moment of that session, that says no. The no signal comes through and says, no, that isn't true. And I even say thank you to the unconscious when it points out the fact I'm not being honest.
Right.
And I put on my best lie face. I try everything to communicate honesty whilst being dishonest. And then we see what the unconscious does. And then when you hand that to the person, they're obviously astonished because they've seen what it can do. And we lead them through it gently. And we do this paced, progressive calibration of signaling. And they then begin to trust themselves. And I then speak to the person and say, will it be all right for me to help name of the person? And then as it starts to say, positive, I say, thank you. And then we build up on that. And we pace the thank you and what we say to the respiration cycle. So usually as a person breathes out, we say, thank you. So they're sinking down deeper into themselves as you say that. And this amplifies the rapport, it amplifies the movement of information between us as a field phenomenon. And then we communicate complete confidence that, yes, I can help you. I've had permission. And
it's kind of, I imagine that when you describe this to people who are not familiar with any of it, they sometimes respond with, horror, sounding like you're doing some kind of occult, contacting with spirits and other woo-woo things, but it really just kind of leaning into the idea that the body is a manifestation of the unconscious. They're connected tightly, and how you're getting communications from multiple bandwidths, so that just deliberately doing it, though. I mean, like with intention, and establishing rapport.
What idiomotor phenomenon are, and that it's simply their unconscious is utilizing that. And it's not through conscious will or intentionality, say that watch is moving, because they're holding it completely still. And we demonstrate how to do that, how to make sure that the chain is straight and that the wrist is completely relaxed, the elbows are supported, completely relaxed, and then it starts to move. And then you might feel it jerk deliberately, and I didn't do that. I said, no, it's your unconscious mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I might say, for example, I'm now speaking directly to the unconscious mind of the name of the person.
Mm-hmm.
It's as if I'm talking around them.
Yeah.
And then we get a response back on that level, and we calibrate it.
Okay.
Do this with everybody in that way, right. But it's an example of how we would use an idiomotor signal. It depends, because some people come because they've been referred by a doctor or through a friend. In that sense, there's an element of trust there already. And we can utilize different approaches.
Yeah. Right. So when it comes to ego strength, just to kind of compare and contrast, I don't do anything like what you're talking about. Not that that's wrong, but mainly I operate more at the conscious level with folks. And being a physician, I focus in on things that do contribute to ego strength, that are perhaps more mundane, but often ignored anyway. Things like diet and getting enough sleep and exercise, making sure you're meeting your physical and your social needs, a mindfulness practice of some kind, centering, body scanning, those kinds of things. Right. So those, and avoiding substances, so it could be that we operate at different levels because our patients tend to maybe be at different levels of functioning. Like if what you're talking about, I think could probably work on anyone, but a lot of folks that I deal with sometimes are just so, they've got drug problems, they've got abuse problems, all this stuff, and it's tough to get in there.
Professor, we get those. We get them as medical referrals, working with doctors, usually GPs, rather than psychiatrists.
Really? Okay, that's strange. It seems like a psychiatrist would love to work with you.
Well, no. Well.
Sometimes
I've worked with psychiatrists as clients, but they tend not to refer, whereas GPs do, which is interesting. Because people present with very complicated biopsychosocial profiles, and we test them on that basis, and we would work with the GP that way. We'd look at the biological, psychological, and social, how all of this is all part of the assessment. We would do that.
Right.
All sorts of other things as well go into the mix. But when it comes to ego strengthening specifically, which is what you mentioned, then when we move into that, then that's what we do. So strengthen the ego by opening communication up in a healing way of the unconscious, because that accelerates things very quickly, but without stress. We're not stressing the person by doing that because they're relaxed.
Right. Okay.
Also getting used to the idea of dissociation as being normal and actually quite pleasant in a controlled way.
But it's a normal function of the psyche.
Obviously somebody who had a psychiatric diagnosis that involved it being contraindicated to dissociate somebody, then that wouldn't happen. We wouldn't do that. We don't do that. So it just depends on how things happen. But typically with someone who is relatively intact, then we would use that.
Right. So like schizophrenia or someone who's floridly manic, you don't want to touch that.
No way. No way.
Yeah. Okay. So that kind of leads me then into some of the dangers, like we're kind of circling around that idea that process of contacting the unconscious and getting into more an integrated stance with it is not just universally always beneficial and good. Sometimes it can go the wrong way. And you guys in your other video, you talked about addiction to fantasy, and you all differentiate fantasy from imagination. In my writing, I made the same distinction, called it different things.
Yeah, it's highly contextual to be, to try to clarify, because it's understandably easy to misinterpret what we mean, and we know that. But
Right.
it's difficult otherwise to make a distinction that is really there unless we're very clear about it, at least on the surface, that imagination and fantasy we try to regard as being separate. Now, obviously, there are levels at which they're not separate.
Yeah.
Fantasy can be very healthy,
Yeah.
productive part of someone's life. But there are times when we see this holding space, this virtual sandbox being created as an artificial place to caffect instinct and libido into, which means that the ego does not adapt to the world. And then you get this repetition compulsion of requiring more fantasy. So it was really to point that out, because not many people do point that out. It's as if fantasy is great. Let's all have fantasy.
More is better.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Freud regarded it as pathological, and that was a little jaundiced, I would expect. And Jung then did the opposite, as we might expect from him. And fantasy was wonderful, but it wasn't particularly wonderful for him all of the time. So we have to be careful.
Well, and he was always very cautious too, and I think that some of that caution has been lost over the years. He was almost afraid of the unconscious sometimes, and he went to great lengths to make sure that he was safe from it. And that probably comes from working with schizophrenics in the early part of his career, and he saw what it could do. Yeah, and of course, I'm sure you've read about folks who thought that maybe Jung had schizophrenia, which I find utterly absurd. He was far too organized for that. He was. Anyone who, you've got to not work with schizophrenics to suspect that. Yeah. So the way I divide it up is basically I incorporated into an analysis of internal imagery, and I say some of it comes from the outside, which would be sensation, and then some of it comes from the inside, which has two sources, and one of which would be ego-driven, like a daydream where I deliberately see what I want to see, and then undirected fantasy, so I use the same term of fantasy. So in your terminology, fantasy would be more ego-driven fantasy versus undirected fantasy, which you guys call imagination.
I think I used the example of imaginal rehearsal as a behavior modification technique, which is a fantasy by any other definition, but it's called imaginal rehearsal. So I try to make this distinction, with the caveat that it's a false one, but a necessary starting point to find out what's really happening. And it's only when we get inside the process dynamics of an individual that it becomes clear about whether we're dealing with fantasy or imagination. But the definition of imagination for us within this very limited context would be that that's basically instinctive pressure, which is pushing the organism towards homeostasis and downstream lifespan development adaptation. So the imagination has a drive attached to it, which is beyond itself, whereas fantasy doesn't. It's a locked-in state. When it becomes pathological, you have that repetition compulsion element to it.
So an example of that, I would think, as I was watching your video, I was thinking about people who get extremely emotionally invested in fictional cinematic universes, like Star Wars fans, which everybody knows that nobody hates Star Wars more than Star Wars fans. And I'm a big Star Wars fan from way back, but I mean, some of these people are just so obsessed with it, and they get enraged when the latest content comes out. It isn't 100% consistent with everything else that's come before. And of course, me being me, I'm looking at this like, why are people doing that? What's up with that? So my first thought on that is that they are so fascinated by the fantasy world that the fiction and stuff has come up with, that their demand for perfect consistency is because they want to stay stuck in it and forget that it's actually fiction. There's anything wrong with fiction necessarily, but they demand perfect accuracy so that they can basically delude themselves.
Yeah, I think that's possible some of the time, and I always try to reserve a judgment on that unless it's clinically necessary to do so in a specific case.
Yeah.
Because
And I'm talking about people who get actually like really enraged by this stuff.
Yeah.
Like well beyond what makes any sense. I mean, if it's just a hobby or if it's something you find fun, great. That's fine. That's kind of where I'm at.
Well,
all the new TV shows and all that kind of jazz. And I don't think it's all perfect, but it doesn't really bother me.
Yeah, I think in cases like that, my own experience, for what it's worth, is that what you see there is a replacement meta-instinct narrative for reality. And that allows them to remain stuck. And even their Panksepian instincts get expressed through this. So in the case of someone who's obsessed with Star Wars too much, then everything will be processed through that. And therefore, there's a deficit with respect to external adaptation in the world. And it's like inflation, but it's not. It's more of a collapse. And when you say fascination, that's an old term for hypnosis, a state of fascination. And when we just observe someone who is fascinated in the ordinary sense, that everything collapses around the object of fascination. And if that object is internal and it's a fantasy system, then the ego and its self-concept start to collapse around that. The outcome is the same as inflation. It's a deflation around that core thing. And you see everything being acted out. So we know there must be a deficit in terms of external adaptation at that point. And one of the ways that we do that then is to utilize the tendency to use that fantasy to actually get inside their unconscious proper. We have a method called dialectical imagery, which we use for that.
Okay. And I'm assuming from the name that it involves engaging in like interactions with these fictional characters to bring out what you're looking for.
It starts that way, and if we do it right, it moves and changes, and that's when it becomes a true dialectic. For example, I've got a couple of YouTube videos up, I think, on case histories of this, but I'll give an example now as briefly as I can. There was one fellow who was covered in psoriasis, and he had been all of his life. He was probably in his 50s at the time. This was about 25 years ago, roughly. And he'd even been to the Dead Sea, and he tried everything, and it wouldn't go away. So I asked him, what's his favorite TV show? And he was Irish, and he gave it me immediately. It was a show called Ballykissangel, which was very popular in the UK at the time. And it was a little village in Ireland with a pub. And this barmaid there that everybody knew, who was warm and welcoming, the typical kind of anima doorkeeper, if you like, if we were looking at it in a Jungian way. So I said, wouldn't it be interesting to go there? And not on the outside, but on the inside. And he agreed with me because I'd already prepared him to agree with the idea, because his unconscious was in rapport and had agreed to allow me to help him. So I then used the language patterning to signal to the unconscious it would be good to use this. And the reason it would be effective is his resistance from his ego would be attenuated because he is himself fascinated by it.
Right.
And therefore, he was already in a trance. And what we did is we took him there, anchored him internally with respect to the imagery in all of the internal generated sensory modalities we could. And then when he entered the pub, there was this goodbye suggestion, if you like, from me, that the solution to his problem can be found on the inside. As he was recounting that his hand was going out towards the door and he's about to enter. And then it was passed over to him and he would recount what happened. And there was the barmaid and she was smiling, but he didn't go to her, he turned left. And then he saw his father there, his deceased father, who was sat there with a pint of Guinness, a nice Irish drink. He shared a pint with his father and had an internal dialogue with him, which I didn't want to hear. I said, this is for you and for him. And he was expressing through his body, his breath would change, not a full-on abreaction, gross idiomotor twitches. And then when he was ready, he breathed out. And then I said, talking now directly to the unconscious mind and we brought him back out. And he said he'd resolved something with his father and he left. And he was the father of someone who worked in the medical center that I was based at the time, a receptionist, young girl. She came back to me and said his psoriasis is gone as a result of that.
Interesting.
And there are other examples of that, but that was quite a clear cut one where you had a psychosomatic transduction of.
Yeah, right. Yes, I've definitely seen that before.
Yeah,
it's quite dramatic when you see that.
very.
Right? You become a real true believer in mind-body connections when you see stuff like that. It's like, whoa, okay, this is for real. It's the real deal.
That was fantasy up to the point where he turned left, and at that point it was a true dialectic on the inside between
Yeah.
ego and his deep unconscious. In the meta-narrative, that had the image or the impression for rapport with that with which his ego was already fascinated, therefore no resistance.
Yeah.
So he got into the meaning of his relationship to his father and his own identity, and that was enough for it no longer to exhibit through his skin.
Yeah, and that's interesting because you have one of the concepts that is kind of a through line through a lot of this kind of work is the idea that the ego kind of needs to align itself with the unconscious.
Yeah.
If it doesn't, is when you run into all these problems. And so in a sense, the self needs the ego to participate, to join along, or else it's not going to get to where it wants to go. And I think it's probably the reason why there is an ego to begin with, because it has the abilities to do things like that.
Yeah, I mean, we have this, again, it's not a dogma, but it's a starting point, which is that we assume that the unconscious does not want to talk to us as we would talk to an outer figure. Mm-hmm. So the external representations of the world that the ego has evolved to deal with should not be replicated internally, because that generates an internal projection over the unconscious. Whereas if the unconscious says, this is what I am, then we tend to get a much quicker, smoother result that way, because we're not plowing through complexes. And in the case of dialectical imagery, we utilize resistance and we utilize surface structure complexes in such a way that the unconscious meets it and then turns it into something else that was completely unexpected. And
yeah, I've used techniques that like I didn't use the terminology that you're using, but I did the same sort of thing with folks before. And sometimes I would use imagery from a dream that they were particularly, concerned about or upset by. And I would say, well, let's kind of walk ourselves back through into that dream and see what happens. Or sometimes I'll have them replay a dream from a different character's perspective in the dream, because I know that it's all coming from the self, essentially. It's constructing the entire narrative, and the ego is just a piece of it.
Yeah.
And sometimes that provides a different point of view. Can be helpful. So how do you think, well, so one piece of this is getting back to the idea of the traps that can happen with excessive use of fantasy. And you mentioned something I've mentioned before too, which is identifying with the myth rather than being inspired by it or learning from it. You talk about that, you and Pauline. So what are some other ways to avoid the trap of getting stuck in excessive amounts of fantasy? What do you think?
Yeah, if someone is in that and they're stuck and they are aware that they're stuck but still defending being stuck, which is a typical neurotic presentation,
right?
We need to perhaps, if we're not going to use the method I've just used now, use something that will bypass that. So we will use a creative medium if that's applicable. Very often people say that I'm not creative, I can't do anything. And that's when a sand tray is a really useful one, because a sand tray is just a space within which we can articulate and arrange representational symbols and figures according to what comes, and that is creative. And we can move on from that into other things. There's so many different levels, but the main thing is get the contact, maintain the rapport, see where the resistance is, pressure test the strength of the ego ongoing, because that can change for the reasons that you mentioned earlier.
Right.
All sorts of reasons can affect that. And we just move on. We utilize the resistance and move around it, always asking for what is within to communicate without in a safe.
Right. Maintain that rapport and that respect.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. So if you have a patient, say, that comes in and presents a vision or a lucid dream, maybe, or an active imagination, I know you've got a lot to say about that. How do you differentiate what's coming from the ego and what's coming from what's fantasy and what's imagination?
Right. That depends on how close we are to the person. So what's the strength or even the ground rules for the rapport field? Because sometimes a person's unconscious will literally hand over everything to you. And on other occasions, it's provisional. It'll say, nothing will happen for 3 months. I've had that happen. And I accept it immediately. And we would then say, for example, well, we can meet again in 3 months. Everything will be fine, because your psyche has said in 3 months, it'll be okay for you to move on and to change. And then I might embed a suggestion about how seasons typically last 3 months.
Right, that's right.
So forth. And might even, if we're in winter, suggest, well, or autumn, fall in America, winter is just an interval between springs. Embeds the suggestion that change is inevitable and it's natural and it proceeds that way. So we use whatever is presented, utilize resistance, and then move on from that. So I guess the short answer is it depends on the quality of the relationship and what's turned up. However, there are things you can do. If we have utilized hypnosis with someone, trance state, and we get so far with that, and then we meet another kind of resistance, which might be in the form of a very powerful complex, it's at that point we utilize it again. And this time we're looking to create a dissociative state. So it would be a double induction. We would re-hypnotize a person again, and not so much deepen the trance, which is a more orthodox way of considering it, but lateralizing the dissociation. So the person can become a real-time observer of that part of themselves which is operating against them and contrary to what the Jungians would call the self. But in such a way that they don't actually care. They don't fear it. Oh, yeah, is that what's happening? There are so many ways of doing that. You can do it through ideomotor phenomenon, for example. So you can, the bilateral of the body is very, very helpful, because you can get the left and the right moving or doing different things, whilst the person just passively watches and it's fascinated by what's going on. The hands levitating and gesticulating or grabbing a particular object, and the other one might be floating off doing its own thing, and one of the legs might be twitching and vibrating. And you manage that, you manage it very, very carefully about the strength, the amplitude of the signal, what they're talking about and saying, and you're moving everything around towards separation, strengthening, and weakening of the other part or other elements, which is then reintegrated, but unable to do anything to harm the ego further. So that's another example. I mean, that's a superficial way and quite a quick, hurried way of describing it, but I'm sure.
So is there characteristics of the fantasy material itself that give you clues?
Yes.
I have a number of things that I look at, but I wanted to hear yours before I...
Zombies is a good one. Zombies is a great one. We've done a video today on zombies.
Zombies, right, okay.
So, yeah, that's a good one. I don't know if I should spoil it really by saying, but this is an empirical thing again. And in the video with James, I discuss how zombies kind of were very low amplitude on the radar of fantasy back in the 80s, but it started to increase through the 90s and then really spike. Before that, it was vampires.
Right.
And we discussed the different horror genres and how these different elements appear to be separate, but at deep structure they're the same. And the symbol as such, if we take it literally, disguises what's going on. And that's the problem. When somebody who is into a fantasy genre is so fascinated, as we were saying before, by the embedded structure of the narrative and of the characters, they are not connected to themselves anymore. They're connected to that fantasy.
Right.
But the amplitude increases in proportion to their need to find out what is behind it. And the resistance is also proportional to that. So we make a judgment on the basis of that. So we can utilize it. We can offer an alternative without calling it an alternative. For example, with the creative therapies, I've used writing as a very, very powerful media where people start to generate spontaneous myth from within themselves. And they suddenly find that far more interesting than what they've been following externally.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So that gives a pretty good idea of how you can differentiate it, like just diagnostically. Like if you were to sit down and do, I know you don't do active imagination very much, but if you were and you heard this narrative from them, you would look at all those things that you just talked about to try to figure out what part of it was imagination and what part was that. So the way I come at this is that I look at characteristics of the narrative that I hear. Like, is it surprising, disturbing, or uncanny? Because if it is, it's, I think, more likely to be coming from undirected sources. Does it tell you things you don't want to hear? Are there messages within it that are things that you really don't want to know or hear? Another one is sometimes there is a quality of ineffability to it. And I think that just kind of connects to the fact that the ego, typically the job of the ego is to try to make sense of things in a very logic and often reductive manner.
Yeah.
And so if you get ineffabilities and antimonies, you're probably closer to the undirected source.
Yeah.
I'm very suspicious of all or nothing dichotomies. Oh, it's just this and just that, and that's that. Power complexes and attachment complexes that are coming through, like, oh, I had this active imagination and I wound up to be Superman. Isn't that great? Doesn't that mean that I'm super awesome? And I'm like, okay, maybe not. Or this person that I've got this huge crush on falls in love with me, that kind of stuff. That clearly we're not in undirected fantasy.
No, but the contents of that stuff is something that very often bottoms out into instinctive meta-narratives. And when people get in that is a completely different place. But what you were saying about active imagination is I don't use it in the way that Jungians use it, but I do use it. But it's
you do? Okay.
Yeah, but it'd be multimodal. In other words, we would be utilizing hypnosis and other things simultaneously. For example, if we do dream work, so-called dream re-entry, you can't re-enter a dream. You're generating a new state. As you were saying about memories being constructive when we last talked.
Yeah, you don't really re-enter it. No, that's true.
Oh. But I'm thinking of one case, a recent example, which I know I can talk about because I know the person concerned, and it would be all right. There was the representation of a dream, which itself was a representation of a video game, which itself was important, pardon me, in this person's life when they were very young. And all of that and other things were simultaneously active within the one dream. So what do we look at? And when he utilized the imagery reconstruction of something approximating the dream whilst in a trance state, and then felt the dissociation of parts of himself being drawn, parts of himself in terms of energy and organization, not at literal subpersonalities.
Yeah.
But being drawn towards either the figure from the video game or the younger version of himself, and being able to see how they were interacting. What appears from that perception of interaction is the missing through line that makes sense of it. So that would be the deep structure, Ariadne's thread, that we need to get hold of in order to lead him out of that maladaptation that was summed up within the dream. And because he's recounting this in a dissociated state, and I can even, or any of us who use these techniques can move the ego's position into any of those stations of self-reference that are occurring, we can get a really good narrative explanation about what's going on, that if we just use active imagination in the way that Jungians do it, it wouldn't happen.
It's much more active.
It can be exhausting, it can be the amounts of concentration that's needed, because you have to watch the whole of that person, everything about them, their pallor, their respiration rate, any movement that's going through, signs of distress. How do you handle quiet times? How do you handle emotion? And a lot of inexperienced therapists panic when there's an abreaction, but it's quite possible for someone to abreact and feel nothing when they're in this state. Not feeling anything at all. There's an affect discharge, but it's not associated to the ego, for example. There's so many things that can happen, and it's a moment by moment working through that process as it exhibits. So for me, that's like active imagination, because it's very active, and there's so much going on, but we're fundamentally appealing to that which regulates everything, rather than only the ego.
Right.
And we'll deliberately talk to that other part of the person that has, I might even use this expression, I often do, has the power to heal. And I might say that the name of the person doesn't need to listen to my voice, knowing that the paradox will mean they'll feel either no or I want to hear it.
Yeah.
And being in that paradoxical state further reduces the tension of consciousness and maintains the trance. And then I might use, say, the double induction, because I might be in communication, say, with a complex and then hypnotize the complex. And I'll ask the ego personality to witness this process as it's unfolding, and then suggest to the complex that it has no means anymore of accessing any energy or libido that is detrimental to the ego. You can use it up as quickly as you like. It just means you will metabolize faster. So you have to slow right down. And once a complex slows down, it becomes ineffective. For example, there's so much you can do with imagery and with the dynamics of that interplay that youngins just don't have a clue about. It's unfortunate, but they just don't have a clue.
Well, maybe they need to fix that.
Well, they don't need to. That's fine. The big ecology out there, but if you can move people along quickly and efficiently and cleanly, then what's the point of spending between 4 and, I've heard in one case, 15 years of analysis? Why put that? When
I've heard of 30-year-long analysis.
Wow.
And, like that's bonkers.
Yeah.
Aren't you better by 30 years?
Yeah.
I mean, what, you're doing something wrong?
Well, how about asking the unconscious, when will it be okay for this person to be all right?
Yeah.
And another favorite metaphor, which works with a lot of people, I think I mentioned before, is about spring and how spring arrives in Britain on the south coast, and it comes at a walking pace. It actually crosses a field at a walking pace. And if someone lives 300 miles from the coast, now how long will it take for someone to walk that distance and bring change and rejuvenation into your life? And the calculation's made, and the unconscious, the finger might move, it'll go, and thank you, and what is or when will that be? And then the person might say 2 weeks. Thank you. And then you agree with it because it's been given from within, not within the ego, not within the conflict, not from a complex, but deep within. And sure enough, people start to change, and they know that the clock is ticking. And I don't know why I changed, but I did. And that lady arrived, didn't she? The lady that represents spring.
Right, of course, the goddess. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And you can say it or you can imply it, but the deep structure understands.
Right. So the strengths, what would you say are the strengths of fantasy? We've talked a lot about the pitfalls.
Yeah.
What are the advantages and the strengths? What does healthy use of fantasy do for you?
I think at its most elemental in terms of clinical use for a person who's suffering is it provides a haven, a respite, a place to put Pangsapien instincts so we can reduce tension in ourselves. If we're in an unbearable situation, but our instincts are still pushing, but we cannot discharge them, we have to deal with that somehow. And repression is one solution which can somaticize, for example, or if there's fantasy, we duct it into that and it rehearses a situation ready. Meanwhile, the imagination as a function within us, and I think imagination is a form of consciousness in and of itself, will be projecting forward and saying, okay, when the time is right, press the trigger, and fantasy emits itself, attaches to the Pangsapien seeking system, and it's out there and we're all right. But for now, we can't do that. So fantasy is important. And another way of doing it, of course, is to access things which are non-personal in representational form as a preparation for the future. And one way that I encourage people to do that is through the concept of ancestral memory, but not personal memory, literally not a personal memory, but a line of ancestors that stretch over your shoulder, over the horizon. And each man will place his hand on the shoulder of his son, if it's a man, who places his hand, and so on. And the message is coming. And they're all agreeing and nodding and saying, when the time is right. And that can be so powerful for someone to say, okay, I'm all right. I can hold the tension now. I'll fantasize. But when that hand touches me on the shoulder, we're good to go.
Mm,
We're out there.
Yeah, it's a very powerful image.
Yeah.
Encapsulates a lot and helps to contextualize a person. I find that a lot of the distress in patients involves feelings of disconnection.
Yeah.
From themselves, from others, from community, from nature, from the past. It's something very disintegrating and corrosive about our current modern society that does that. And that's the cultural layer of causing mental illness that nobody wants to really talk much about.
No.
But then like you say, the fairy tales or fantasy narratives or whatever, I think Pauline mentioned that fairy tales have an even more fundamental, and Von Franz agreed with her on that.
Yeah.
So she's in great company there.
Yeah.
That they distill these universal situations, and I think they provide a lot of comfort, because the ego always feels like it's floating in the void, right? If the ego is separated, it isn't really, but it feels like it is so frequently. And so upon hearing a fairy tale, it connects back to the ancestors, towards time immemorial, and all of this sort of, the mystery of cosmos and all that. But then you mentioned what essentially I would say as the power of that fantastical narrative, or whatever it is, to bring you into the world, to push you into the world, not to retreat within the fantasy and stay there forever. Worrying about the latest Star Wars TV show or whatever it is. I'm picking on Star Wars fans today, but and I can do that because I was there day one, way back. But just to talk about how I think that the function, or the push that the imagination is doing and saying, hey, ego, why don't you fantasize about something? They can work together. Like, that's where that blurry line is, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, they work together. And one thing that comes to mind talking about this is the studies that show that trauma actually appears to hamper people's ability to imagine and fantasize about different scenarios. Like, trauma hits it, and we know from brain studies that like the hippocampus and a couple of other areas, they seem to, in the context of a severe trauma or PTSD, they don't work as well until they start getting better. And of course, the big question is the recovery from the trauma healing the imagination, or is the imagination healing the trauma? I don't know. It's chicken or the egg.
I think that's a great question for anybody.
I don't know.
To attempt to answer in a reductive sense. I think if we take a superpositional perspective, it almost doesn't matter, because the two correlate.
Right.
And
exactly.
Form a kind of a field that is resonant enough that a change in one is likely to affect the other. So then it would be, well, how do we make that change? How do we generate something? And that could be a fantasy that's utilized by a therapist as a healing mechanism, which then starts to change things at that level, at a neurophysiological level within the hippocampus, which of course is involved in memory and learning.
Yeah, it is. And in constructing new scenarios and imagining new scenarios, people that have like brain damage to the temporomedial parietal region, particularly on the right side, not only do they have difficulty with imagination, but of course they can't really dream very well either. Like Solms talks about this in his work.
He does.
Those are the only cases of people that have truly anonyria, which would be lack of the ability to dream. Most other people dream all the time, but they just don't remember it,
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. I don't know how Mark would feel about this, but somebody needs to work with hypnosis in a non-reductive way, because most neuroscientists who look at it, or think they are looking for a specific state with no crossover with anything else. And so there has to be a trance state which is reducible, and we can say that is hypnosis and not imagination or not something else. Whereas the best hypnotherapists, and they do have to be the best ones, not these, very low, unfortunately low grade, very inexperienced people, they will approach the phenomenon of a human being as a complete system. So it doesn't matter whether there's a formal trance. For example, I always say that so-called depth of trance is immaterial. And yet the neuropsychologist wants there to be a deep trance, which you can say that is specifically trance. I say, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is what happens when the rapport field is mobilized. So if it were possible to work with people, with a good hypnotherapist, to work with someone like Mark, and then he would probably see paradoxes emerge that he couldn't explain, which is that there is no apparent specific state, which is called hypnosis, but this person is responding. And then the skeptics would say, well, they're acting. They're not really hypnotized, but they're acting.
Right. That's what they used to say about lucid dreaming too, but then they don't say that anymore, do they?
No.
Now we know lucid dreaming is real.
No.
That's very interesting that you say that, because I mean, Jung, I'm sure he was familiar with hypnosis, but he only talked in general terms, more like you do, in the sense of I'm lowering a lowering of consciousness, and that's it. He didn't say there was some discrete, clearly defined, hardly defined state necessarily. It was just you flow into it. And
yeah, he was heavily influenced, wasn't he, by Piaget, and he had the
absolutely.
That abasement was one of the primary elements, as you know, obviously in Piaget's model.
Yeah.
Jung did say that he had no doubt that he could have achieved a great deal with hypnosis, but he said he didn't want to do that. He wanted to look in other places.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably, to be fair to him, a fair reflection of the state of hypnosis as it was understood at the time.
Right.
It's moved on so much now.
Clearly, from talking to you, I can tell. Yeah, the techniques are so much more sophisticated.
It is sophisticated, but I'm also aware I'm kind of talking as if I'm only.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
I do a lot of things, but I would not be without that, because I honestly believe that's the foundational skill.
Yeah. So I guess my last question for you I have today, to share notes on is, would you say that is there a broad principle that you operate by that would describe the fundamental difference between healthy and unhealthy use of fantasy? Are there any major principles that you think are important to remember?
In broad terms, and again, I'd have to go back to what I said earlier.
Just in broad terms, yeah.
If it's just me repeating myself on that, I want to know how well homeostasis is working for someone.
Yeah.
That's the main thing.
Okay.
It can be broken in lots of little different ways, but still be, healthy and live an authentic life.
And that's where your starting place is.
The starting place is that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I like that. My starting place is how rigid is in that person's mind. How rigid is the boundary between the imagination or the fantasy and the outer world? I think that particularly folks that get caught up in fantastical, cinematic universes and all that, one of the reasons why they get stuck is because they believe that there's absolutely no application of any of this stuff into the real world.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's one reason they defend it, because they don't want to leave that. They feel like there's this rigid dichotomy between putting away childish things and entering the world of serious adult matters and forgetting about the fantasy, and they don't want to do that. And I think I respect that.
I do.
But of course, I can tell you do. But the real solution then is to lower the wall and break it down, which is a lesson of many famous fantasy narratives, like Wizard of Oz, and a whole slew of them.
Oh yeah, there's so much, isn't there, that will correlate with that. If I was to challenge the youngins on one thing to open a dialectic with them, it would be, if you believe so much in the power of the self, why don't you talk to it?
Yeah.
And as it happens, I do believe in the power of it, and I do talk to it. And I'm not the only one. lots of people with my background talk directly to what they would understand to be the self archetype, but they say it's so difficult to get there, but it isn't. You just ask politely.
Yeah. That's great. That's awesome. I don't think I can top that. So I think we'll wrap it up there.
It's wonderful to talk to you, Professor. I'd love to talk to you again soon. Thank you. And Pauline sends her best wishes.
Okay, great. I hope to see her next time as well.
Thank you. Blessings. And I'll get the recording to you.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.
Bye bye.